the situation in economy is really bad, and we understand that like in a year, in 2 years, in 3 years, the Russian Federation will have no instruments to proceed with the war. But as of now, I think that even now the Russian Federation could have stopped if they didn't have the support from China and India.
Hello and welcome to Frontline. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're speaking to Ilona Khmeleva, Secretary of the Economic Security Council of Ukraine. Ilona, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting.
On Tuesday, President Putin announced that Russia's growth in 2025 had dropped to just 1%. How do we think they got to that position, and what does that mean for the Russian war economy?
I think that for the Russian war economy, it's a really bad situation. And of course, it's really funny to listen to the president of the Russian Federation, who's already admitted this. But he also made another comment that it's a really man-made change, and that actually it was connected to some economic decisions from the Russian Federation to lower the inflation, etc. So he told that for them it was expected. I think that the situation is totally different because in general, the Russian Federation has no other way than to admit that the situation is really bad in the economy, and they cannot just keep going with their lies that everything is okay. So it's really good for us. On the other hand, it's very important also to assess the efforts of Ukraine and of the European governments, of the US, in the economic pressure, I mean sanctions and export controls. So I think that all in all that brought some results. And now we see that the Russian economy is not in a very good condition. Even when we are seeing some negotiations which are going on now, I think that we would have seen none of them if the situation in the economy will be different.
And you say that the Russians have tried to put this down to an attempt to reduce inflation, but how much do we think that this slowdown in the Russian economy could actually be attributed to international sanctions?
I think that it may be attributed to the international sanctions. It's always a great question to say whether the sanctions are totally effective, efficient, or not. So it's really hard to say that all the results were brought only by sanctions, because also there are some spendings of the Russian Federation for the military, which are usually very, very huge, and it also influences sometimes the economic situation. But all in all, I think that the result from sanctions is one of the reasons why we have these changes. And also, I can give you just a really bright example from the Ukrainian intelligence. So it's not some sophisticated numbers from the economy, but it's about how Russians went to shops and stores during the New Year and Christmas holidays. And we saw that like there were like 20% less Russians who went to stores and bought something. So it demonstrates that already some citizens do feel the changes. I'm sorry for this. We have some problems with electricity, but we will go on soon normally. So the problem is that the Russian Federation is already facing the changes. And I also think that sanctions in some coming weeks will even bring more results, because we see more resolve both from the EU and from the US to change the situation and to make some pressure with a view to bring in the Russian Federation to some peace deal, or at least ceasefire.
And Russia relies heavily, of course, on its energy industry and oil exports. That's been buffeted since the start of the year, and before then even, by seizures of Shadow Fleet tankers, and now the threat of a halt in Indian oil imports as well. Where's that going to leave Russia's energy industry at the moment, and how much has the situation changed even in the last year?
So the situation, even during the last year, has dramatically changed because we see that the production of the crude oil has lowered very much in the Russian Federation. For example, we saw that there were like 9.3 million of barrels per day, and it's really low for the Russian economy on one hand. On the other hand, we also see that the Russian Federation already has some problems with the shadow fleet, but still a lot of countries do help the Russian Federation to proceed with the situation. As far as we know, there are like more than 2,000 or even up to 3,000 by some estimates of these vessels which the Russian Federation uses, unfortunately, still. And this week, President Zelensky provided the number that 122 vessels are owned or registered in Europe. So the bad news is that there are still problems in Europe. The good news is that the EU has the leverage. So we also can make the situation worse for the Russian Federation. I also believe that Ukrainian long-range strikes made the difference, and actually, it's our favorite, sort of sanctions because they have immediate effects on the Russian energy sector. And I also believe that if we have some more support in military sphere from our from the countries from the coalition which support Ukraine, actually, it also could make a difference. And when we are talking about the possibility of the Russian Federation to proceed with war and the immediate effects on the battlefield, I think that actually the energy sanctions and energy limitations are the most effective ones because they have the immediate effect on the economy.
And we talk about some of those long range strikes that go on that affect both Shadow Fleet ships now, but also refinery done within Russia proper itself. Is there a kind of double effect here in that the Russians often claim they're able to rebuild a lot of the refineries that are struck or bring online other refineries? How tricky will that become if the Russians aren't able to import the parts to repair some of these refineries that have been destroyed?
Yes, so the problem is that they still can rebuild some plants and the other parts of the infrastructure. A very good news from the sanctions coalition is that the Russians still have a lot of dependence on the Western components for this, and actually they do need it. Of course, China is an elephant in the room, and they a little bit help the Russian Federation even with this fear. But we see the combined effect. And actually, I also believe that when we're talking about sanctions policy, military support for Ukraine, etc., we need to have a combined strategy. For example, we define as Ukraine, as our other countries which are supporting Ukraine, that the energy sector is something which is the most important, and we need to combine different instruments. I mean, in like economic pressure, more sanctions against the shadow fleet, more economic sanctions against the energy sector, more export controls against some instruments or even means of productions which are used in this sector, and of course military strikes against the Russian Federation. And here the Ukrainian armed forces are doing a great job, and we also already have some drones, etc., which can influence the Russian Federation very badly. But here we still need, of course, the military support, but also intelligence support. And I think that this, like combining all these instruments, actually can make a difference.
And we spoke about China there for a moment. Putin and China's Xi Jinping have spoken publicly this week, declaring that they will continue to deepen their economic and security ties. But how heavily is Russia relying on China at the moment economically? And given the difficulty it's facing in 2026, is Beijing likely to aid or take advantage of the Kremlin's kind of narrowing trade options here?
Yeah, the problem is that Russia is hugely relying on China. And what we see at the Economic Security Council, so we've made a lot of investigations throughout this year concerning sanctions evasion schemes. And we understood that unfortunately, the Russian Federation now uses a lot of components or means of production which come either from China or from the Western countries through China. And of course, it's very hard to influence China itself, but actually there are some room for changes. For example, what we saw is that a lot of Chinese companies which are trading with the Russian Federation and which are giving Russia some components for the military industrial complex are also having a lot of trade with the European Union. And if we are talking about secondary sanctions and more export controls, these limitations potentially could really limit the possibilities of these companies. And I think that, of course, China wants to have good relations with the Russian Federation, but if we are comparing the trade of China with the Russian Federation and with the other part of the world, then of course the Russian Federation will decide to have some relations with the EU. So this is the leverage, and actually new secondary sanctions could potentially make a difference, and including more Chinese companies and other representatives to the sanctions list, even in the new 20s package, which is being prepared by the EU, is quite important. But we have other countries like India, for example, and when we're talking about oil, what we see is that last year, 25% of the crude oil, which is brought by sea from the Russian Federation, went to India. And the situation is not changing. So we saw some statements by President Trump earlier this week. I think it was really optimistic to hear this from Kiev. But then we also saw and heard the statements from the Russian Federation, from India, that actually the situation is not so far developing. So it's hard to influence third countries concerning sanctions evasion schemes and concerning stopping helping the Russian Federation. But I think that it's our biggest task as of now, because actually these countries make the Russian Federation in a position to proceed with the war. And actually, they also save some time for the Russian Federation, because as we started our conversation, the situation in economy is really bad, and we understand that, like in a year, in 2 years, in 3 years, the Russian Federation will have no instruments to proceed with the war. But as of now, I think that even now the Russian Federation could have stopped if they didn't have the support from China and India.
Yeah, and where do you judge the international community to be on sanctions and limitations and bans on the Russian Federation? I mean, we've heard this week FIFA President Gianni Infantino calling for the lifting of the ban on Russian athletes, claiming that these bans have achieved nothing. That's not really the truth, though, is it? And what is the reality of these bans and sanctions on Russia? Even non-economic things like those on sports players.
Yeah, it's not even the truth. I do agree with you. So, of course, these kind of sanctions do not bring the difference in the battlefield, but these kind of sanctions demonstrate the position of the European Union, of the US, of the UK concerning the Russian Federation. And under international law, the countries have the obligation not to recognize some unlawful situations and to make some steps to stop them. So I think that these sanctions also demonstrate this resolve. I also very much liked the position of the European Sport Commissioner, which was published this week, that the EU is for the sanctions to be introduced and to stay in force, even in the sports sector. And I really think that it's important because, like, for the Russian Federation, is also a part of their international picture, and for them, it is important to come back to sports and to be represented as nothing happened. And I think that it is the biggest question. So today, they are just committing war crimes in Kiev and in some other parts of Ukraine. And like today, they are also participating in some huge competitions. So it's not okay. And the other example, which we also saw this week, that the Russian Federation has already made huge cyber attacks against Olympic infrastructure. And Italy has publicly made this attribution. So, of course, the Russian Federation's MFA yesterday told that it's nonsense. But we all understand that the Russian Federation is now attacking like civilian infrastructure in the European Union, including the sport infrastructure. And if they are doing so, then the hybrid aggression or the cyber aggression is already going on. And I think that the Western countries just cannot ignore this. And doing business with Russia as usual, it's not a good strategy, because for Russians, it's just weakness, which you demonstrate, and they will go on with their attacks.
Yeah, and we talk about these war crimes, some of them alleged, but many of them proven to be true. We know that there are ongoing strikes on Ukrainian civilian energy infrastructure that's being used was being used to heat homes for Ukrainians. How severe is the situation in Ukraine's energy infrastructure at the moment, and what is the route to repairing those systems?
Yeah, so the situation is quite bad, and even in Kiev, we have a lot of houses, like thousands of houses, without electricity and without heating. As you may have heard, the weather is also not helping us. That is why actually a lot of people are just staying without any possibility to be in comfort during winter time. And what we saw is that many of them are even leaving Kiev or some other big cities because they don't have the possibility to proceed like this. It's also very hard because like keeping a war economy in Ukraine also relies very much on the infrastructure, and we understand that this damage is quite huge. So, if, for example, we are talking about the like the capacity to produce energy, it has dropped dramatically, and we do not have enough even for our critical infrastructure sometimes. So that is why like we have electricity for sometimes like for 2 or 3 hours. So you saw it like during our talk today. And unfortunately, the situation is even worse in the regions which are closer to the front line. And we understand that unfortunately the Russian Federation is still committing these attacks. And in my personal opinion, so this is their militarist strategy. So committing war crimes is actually part of the military strategy, unfortunately. And this is their leverage which they are using during the negotiations. So a lot of experts say that, okay, the Russian Federation is continuing with these strikes, so they don't want to negotiate. And my idea is that they are negotiating this way because, unfortunately for them, they cannot change the situation dramatically in the military, like they mentioned, because the front line, of course, is moving a little bit, but so they cannot have all and gain all the territories which they can, but they can use the acts of terror against the civilians just to push forward their agenda. So here, Ukraine once again needs a lot of support from our partners, and I think that there are like two dimensions. First dimension is military one, so we need to close the sky over Ukraine somehow, and all the components and all the like the instruments which help us are really necessary. And the other is of course humanitarian help, because like generators, batteries, etc. for people are highly needed. And I think that we need to change the situation. In the long run, of course, Ukraine is also developing some other means like other types of generation of energy, less centralized generation, etc. But everything takes time, and we need to make a difference already. But just maybe the last idea about this. So we are talking a lot about the best ways to make the situation normal. But unfortunately, when you have winter, when you have really, really, really cold winter, you have like a city with millions of people there, and you have huge strikes which happen like each night or like each like every several nights. You just cannot live a normal life. So I think that the best option is to stop the Russian aggression, because like on the each other options bring some sufferings and also bring new and new problems for which actually Ukrainians are paying by their lives, and our partners are paying a lot in terms of support and other means of solidarity.
And on that foreign support for Ukraine, we've heard that the EU have this week finalised the 90 billion euros loan deal that was agreed with Ukraine late last year. How crucial is that monetary support going to be for Kyiv?
It's really crucial because we like this money hugely, and actually, it's a great news that the ambassadors have voted. We still have, so we still need a voting from the European Parliament, but I think that it will not be a problem as of now because, like, the ambassadors have agreed on everything. It's also quite good that they have disseminated the money, so they have 60 billion for the military budget and 30 billion for support of our other issues, like civilian support and some salaries for people, etc., etc. So I think that it's important. It's also important demonstration to the Russian Federation that Ukraine will still have some resources to proceed and to defend ourselves throughout 2026. So, in my opinion, it's really important. And as far as we know, the first payments are expected to be made in early April. So, according to Ukrainian budgetary planning, it's also quite optimistic, and I very much hope that this will take place. And actually, this also demonstrates that the European Union still has some solidarity inside itself and the possibility to come to some results. Even a quite good idea, which was like pushed by France in this, I don't know, decision, is like made in Europe concept when the European Union like prioritized the military stuff which is made either in Ukraine or in the EU. But we also understand that there is like political decisions that if there are no good systems in the EU or in Ukraine, we still can buy something from the US or from the UK, for example, using this money. And it's also a good idea because sometimes it's not only about like choosing some country. It's when we have no other options, we need to choose something which is the most effective thing to protect us as of now.
And this decision came to you to fund Ukraine with this 90 billion euros came after the European Union wasn't able to convince Belgium to use frozen Russian assets to provide this cash. Um, is there still a level of frustration that those funds are just sat, not used?
I think that there is some level of frustration. Of course, I'm an international lawyer, and I do believe that if there is a breach of peremptory norms of international law, of jus cogens, so the country, the state which breached it shall pay for this. And we also understand that the concept which is used now, that it's like just a debt from the European Union and Ukraine will never pay it, actually. So I do understand it because like we will pay it if the Russian Federation stops its aggression and pays reparations for us. I don't believe that the Russian Federation will pay anything, especially directly to Ukraine. So, unfortunately, of course, we have the same situation as before. That for Ukraine is just support from our partners, but I am not very happy that European taxpayers like are covering the price which the Russian Federation brought both to Ukraine and to Europe. So it's not very good, like in the long run perspective, because it also demonstrates, for example, to China or some other countries which are not so in line with international law sometimes, that the responsibility for crimes doesn't always come quickly. So, of course, yes, there is some kind of frustration on one hand, but also there is some kind of happiness that we have the decision, and it was actually made quite quickly. And this decision also, I think, is very important for the US now because if we didn't have this decision, I think that the Trump administration would have been very unhappy and would not be moving with some negotiations both with the EU and with Ukraine. So, yeah, not perfect, but at least it's better than nothing.
Well, Ilona Khmeleva, the Secretary of the Economic Security Council of Ukraine, thank you very much for joining me today on Frontline.
Thank you very much for inviting, and thank you for highlighting the situation in Ukraine.